Bundy, you big fat turd. Don't dumb yourself out of business, Ernie Ladd would say. Today we're going to talk about one of the territories in professional wrestling. And that territory it was called Mid-South. And basically it was Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and some of Arkansas. You're talking about, this is great pro wrestling era. When I was there, some of the wrestlers that were there was Junkyard Dog. He was the top good guy in the area. Then we had guys like on the good guys side, White Lightning Tim Horner, Art Cruz from Portland. The very first night I come in, I worked a house show in Jackson, Mississippi. Art Cruz was there, and we're told to go 20-minute draw, 20-minute Broadway. I get in the ring, and I said, "Hey, where are you from?" I said, "It's my first night in." He goes, "It's my first night in." I said, "Where are you from?" He goes, I just left Portland." I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll call a lot of Buddy Rose stuff." He goes, "What?" I said, "You know shit, Buddy Rose?" I said, "I'll do that shit with you," because I used to be Buddy's partner in Portland in like 1979 and 80. He said, "All right, that's awesome." So anyway, you'll see guys, and in 10 years later, you'll be somewhere else in some other territory, and you hadn't seen them since then. You go back talking the same old stories about who are the rats in the area, who was working the top programs. Is this guy still there? Is the ring guy still there? Is this manager still there? Because there wasn't no internet then, and you didn't know all the information stuff. So it was great. So when a new guy would come in from a territory, you could talk with him a long, long time and see what the hell was going on. Then other people in Mid-South, Mr. Olympia. Mr. Olympia was Jerry Stubbs, and he was a guy that was a great worker, and he was jacked. And he wore that hood on, that mask, and you just knew he was a stud. And that was Mr. Olympia. And that was Jerry Stubbs. And he used to always, he didn't leave home that much. He liked to work the Pensacola area, and he lived basically on the beach there. And he worked for Ron Fuller for years and years. At one time, he was Mr. Olympia, and Arn Anderson was Super Olympia. But that was another day. Now, Magnum TA, he'd been working underneath in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this was his first time he was coming into Mid-South, and Bill Watts was going to show him how to be a star. So his wrestling name was Magnum TA. It was Terry Allen, but he looked like Magnum TA, the TV star that was hot on TV at that time. And then there was Mr. Wrestling 2. Mr. Wrestling 2 was Johnny Walker, and he wore the hood, and he was famous for the slap of the back of the neck when he hit you with that big knee lift finisher. And he's a real veteran by this time.
Anytime a man defeats me, as a man, I'll be the first to stand and congratulate him.
And it's funny, when we go to Oklahoma City, Tulsa, a lot of times we'd fly there, and there would this major superstar. There's Junkyard Dog. There's Hacksaw Jim Duggan. There's King Kong Bundy. There's Ted DiBiase. There's Butch Reed. Then all of a sudden, there's this old guy that was balding, and you didn't know that was Mr. Wrestling 2. So we got to kayfabe that. The other wrestlers that were wrestling there at that time was Boris Zirkoff. And he had been, what's funny, he had been Private Jim Nelson working in Charlotte as an American private, American soldier. Now all of a sudden he's the evil Boris Zirkoff Russian. And it was good to ride with Boris, and you get him wound up, and he'd start cussing. His nickname was Buffalo Head, and he had this huge cranium, and he'd get upset and he'd turn red. But he was a good attitude, and hell, he weighed about 285, and he could bump like he weighed 200 pounds. So he was great to have on the card. And then Hacksaw Butch Reed was there. Butch Reed was a guy that was jacked. He was built. He could do everything in the ring. He could talk, and he was just a really, really good pro. So Butch Reed was there. In its infancy, this is when Dr. Death, Steve Williams, was just sort of starting out. So you wouldn't see him very much. But I remember working with him in Oklahoma City, and Bill Watts would you'd work Oklahoma City, Tulsa every 2 or 3 weeks on a Sunday. It was a double shot. So you'd worked really hard and you had the long trips and everything. But I was working with Dr. Death. So I went in the ring and Watts put me with Dr. Death. So I was supposed to do him right. So I said, come here. And we just did a stare down. So he did something and I got in his face and he didn't back down. I hit that son of a bitch in the face as hard as I could. I just slapped him. And this was Dr. Death, Steve Williams. And you didn't do that to Dr. Death, but he started to fucking kill me. And I said, not yet, Doc. I looked left, looked right. I hit that son of a bitch again as hard as I could. Just a slap. Boom. Now he's running in place. I went to slap him the third time. He blocked it. He paintbrushed me. You could see the blood, my mouth going to the left, to the right, to the left. And all of a sudden, I said, okay, Oklahoma stampede me right now. All of a sudden, they rang the bell. He picked me up and he gave me his big finish hold. 1, 2, 3. I lost right there. I made him carry me out of the ring. Dr. Death was over like Rover, and Watts bonused me and give me double pay for that first time in the ring with Dr. Death, Steve Williams. And he said, I never seen anybody do that before. I said, well, I'm glad I did. You liked it, and you said you're a bonus to me, so I'm holding you up to that. So that was cool. And then Hacksaw Jim Duggan was there. Ho! So Jimbo was there working. And then Ted DiBiase, this was before he was the $1 Million Man. He was just the great wrestler, Ted DiBiase. And Ted DiBiase was, of course, he was a second generation wrestler with his dad. And his mother was a wrestler too. So he was brought up in the business. And Ted was a huge guy. And what's so funny, he was one of those guys, they all come out around the Amarillo, Texas. And all these people like Bruiser Brody, Stan Hansen, Tully Blanchard, Ted DiBiase, all these guys, there's about 7 of them, Big Bad Bobby Duncan, Tito Santana, they all went to the same college and played football. Basically at the same time, but they really were worth a shit as a football team. And that's funny, but they all became great wrestlers. It was in Amarillo, and that's where the great Dory Funk Sr. had his territory at the time. So who else was in the territory at that time? Well, you had the great manager, Skandor Akbar. And a lot of times he'd spend the night, he'd come over to my house. So I'd fix him food, and then he'd always want the free haircut.
And last but not least, that mangy junkyard dog.
The free beard job, the free dye job. My wife would do that, and she'd rib him, and he had the big hairy back. So a lot of times she would shave it as a rib and make marks in it and everything. So he'd sort of rib him, but he didn't care. But he'd bring a watermelon over. It cost $1, and we'd call it even. So it was great having Skandar Akbar sleep on your couch. Now, Dewey Robertson, the missing link, he was there performing for Midsouth. And at the time I met him, Dewey's like 46 years old. And this was the first time he was, that I remember he did the missing link gimmick. He had the shaved head. He was jacked to the gills. He'd make trips, and he'd always wore a little hat, and he hardly ever spoke. But he had been a great baby face years before. He was always built. He was always a pro. He knew what to do. And whenever it was his turn to drive, he'd always act like he was going to go to sleep. So we just say, pull over, Dewey. And then me and Bundy would be there just laughing. We'd act like we're going to sleep and then all of a sudden he'd shake his head, and all of a sudden he'd wake up and drive the rest of the way home. And then Doug Vines was there. Doug Vines and George Weingroff were there. They were there, and I'd been with those guys in ICW. A lot of guys from ICW, they went to Mid-South. Ronnie Garvin got me booked there. He got almost everybody. He was big buddies with Watts, and they understood each other, and he knew that anybody he hired from ICW was going to be able to handle any job, baby face or heel, underneath, on top, whatever was needed, because that's just the way it was at the time. And the big thing about Mid-South Wrestling is it was unbelievable because they had all these markets, and they ran towns like Oklahoma City, Tulsa. Now they run New Orleans every Monday night. And I worked 2 Superdome shows there. And here's the thing about it. One of the Superdome shows did 35,000 people there. And it wasn't like when WWE leaves a town dark for a year, then all of a sudden they have a big super spectacular there and they sell out. Every Monday night there was pro wrestling in New Orleans. Then they had the great town of Houston in the state of Mississippi. Once a month we were in Greenville. Once a month we were in Greenwood. Once a month we were in Jackson. Once a month we were in Biloxi. Once a month we were in Vicksburg. They love their pro wrestling in Mississippi. Now in Louisiana, they ran Baton Rouge. Now that was close to New Orleans. And then Shreveport was where we did our TV. Well, right outside of Shreveport, it was at the Irish McNeil Boys Club. And I lived in Bossier City, which is right next to Shreveport. A lot of the guys lived in Bossier City. It's like at the apartment complex where I was at, there was me. There was George Weingroff, who was in ICW as a babyface. There was King Kong Bundy. And then the bosses, when Bill Watts wasn't there, was Ernie Ladd, 6'9" in Texas tall, the living legend Ernie Ladd.
Mr. TV announcer, I'm not a challenger. I am a champion. I've been a champion all my life.
Rogers, who was the best heel you ever seen? You, Ernie. Rogers, who's the best babyface you ever seen? You, Ernie. That's why I love that boy. He knows the right answers. A lot of trips I'd make would be me and Big Fat Bundy, King Kong Bundy. Bundy, you big fat turd. Don't dumb yourself out of business, Ernie Ladd would say. I'd make a lot of trips with King Kong Bundy, and Bundy was just so fucking cool. Bundy was Chris Powley's from New Jersey, and when he was in Dallas, he was Big Daddy Bundy. And they'd shaved his head, so he'd come over to Bill Watts as King Kong Bundy. I remember me and him we was riding down the highway, and all of a sudden some motorcycle guys come back and say, "Hey, fuck you, Bundy, you big fat turd," or whatever, to Bundy. Bundy just calmly pulled his gun out of the glove box, and then he had switched over to his left hand, and he started shooting at him. It was over their head and everything, but all of a sudden you see the motorcycles going in and out and in and out. And that was pretty, and that was pretty cool. And then Grizzly Smith was there, and we always said they had 2 agents. One was like 6'9" and one was like 6'10". So you had Ernie and you had Grizz. And we always said, well, Grizz was watching Ernie so that he didn't play pinball all night. And Ernie was watching Grizz because Grizz would be there running all the women away from the back doors because they wanted to go out with all the guys. So Grizz was there to keep from the guys from picking up women all the time. But such was life. In the meantime, we had such good towns to work there. Like we worked Little Rock, Arkansas once a month. It was always great there. Alexandria, Louisiana, Monroe, Louisiana. Like I said, I lived in Bossier City, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Shreveport, Baton Rouge, New Orleans. These were all great towns in Louisiana. And then Bill Watts also owned Houston. Houston is like if it ran every 3 weeks, it would sell out every time. Sometimes they go a couple weeks in a row, sometimes 3 times in a row on a Friday night, and it wasn't as good. But Paul Bosch was the great promoter there, and he had the TV on Channel 39, and Houston wrestling was just so over. And a lot of guys would be flying in just to work Houston. And the good thing about Bill Watts' territory is that they got all these TVs with Bill Watts' wrestling. And then Fritz Von Erich, the promoter in Dallas and Fort Worth, and most of Texas, his TV was on this Christian network, and it was even stronger than Bill Watts' TV. And they had the great world-class championship wrestling TV with the Von Erichs, the Freebirds, Chris Adams, Akbar was on there. So these guys were like double hit. So that like anytime when they was on that Superdome show, all the guys that worked Watts' territory would be on it. he might have he might have like a match from Dallas. He might have the three Von Erich brothers against the Freebirds. Wow, a main event anywhere in the world. Then off the Atlanta TV, where Ole Anderson was the boss and he was the booker, he might have a couple matches off Atlanta. So you got like a Superdome show so stacked with the stars of Mid-South, the stars of world-class championship wrestling, and the stars of Superstation WTBS. So it didn't get any better than that. So Bill Watts drew the most per capita of anybody there was. And I made more money there working underneath than any place I'd ever worked before. And there was no complaints there. And all you had to do is shut up, have a good attitude, try and work out, because we drove like we were truck drivers. It was tough and we was rough. But you take that time in the dressing room to do push-ups and squats, maybe have some rubber bands with you, some light-ass dumbbells if you couldn't get to the gym. I always got to the gym, but a lot of guys made a lot of excuses, and there is no excuse. You're making a lot of money. You're in a business that you want to excel in. You're working for Bill Watts. It could get you booked anywhere in the world, and it didn't get any better than that. If you needed a draw any night, you got it. If you needed trouble with the ride, at the time, Mike Smith, Sam Houston, he was like 18 or 19 years old. So if somebody's car broke down and you were living like I was in Bossier City, you'd take your car to Mike. Mike would know right to where. He knew everybody to get everything. If you had trouble with anything, you asked Grizzly Smith's son, Mike, and he'd take care of you. Now, Jake had grown up there, and that's where he learned the business, but he wasn't there at that time. But Grizzly was there for years. Ernie Ladd was there for years. And he was just a superstar, and they made a very good team. And Bill Watts, he was a rough, tough guy. And if you were having trouble with somebody in the ring and didn't like it, he'd just tell you to go in the dressing room and fight it out, and then it's over with. In other words, he didn't want to go through the bullshit of listening to the trouble you was having with this guy, that you didn't like this guy. Hey, you're there to work hard. You're there to make money. You're there to learn the business more. And once you serve your time there, he would always help you get a job somewhere else. I was in Mid-South and Kamala was there. And then he'd switched over and worked in Dallas. So they were seeing him a lot of times on both stations. Dallas was like, it was like another superstation. And wrestling was so great then. That's where they grew the most crowd, the biggest fucking crowds, and wrestling was just on fire. Fritz Von Erich was a wrestler. He was a promoter. Ole Anderson was a wrestler. He was a promoter. Bill Watts was a wrestler. He was a promoter. Guys that ran the business were the guys that started with nothing, learned this stuff, produced great television, learned the business, how to be nice and how to be fair but firm with the guys. You didn't let the guys run all over you. Getting to work for Bill Watts was awesome. Getting to learn the business under him, you sit there, you watched, you shut up, and you learned. The next place you went to, you were a whole lot smarter. And if you worked for Bill Watts, they knew you were an accepted pro. So most of the time at Mid-South while I was there, the star among stars was none other than the Junkyard Dog. The Junkyard Dog in the South was such a tremendous, tremendous draw. A lot of times, New Orleans, they'd be turning them away at the door. They just all wanted to see that dog. And the fans would be cheering, who they gonna beat that dog? Who dat? Who dat? The first time I saw that, wow, I could not believe it. But Junkyard Dog, when I was in Mid-South, he was like the god of wrestling. And the people there, he was voted the most popular pro athlete in Louisiana. So anyway, a little bit of Mid-South from my experience there. It was a great time. It was a great learning experience. It was after I went there, I went to Ron Fuller's in Pensacola. And so after this week, we might speak at Ron Fuller. I might talk about the Maritimes. So be ready for any of them, because you know how I am. I'm not all there. I change my mind a lot.
I said, get ready, get ready, get ready. I got the dots on. I got the elbow ready, baby. We're going to see it. Let's do it right now.